Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Daily Live series. Today I'm going to talk about a powerful tool that's been around for over a century, and I'm going to unpack why it is so powerful as a lever in making dynamic leadership practical, actionable, and something that can take anyone from where they are and make significant progress towards their goals in terms of how they want to show up as a leader. And I'll talk about that today. In most leadership and communication training, questions are treated as tools for insight, ways to help someone think more clearly after emotion is already formed. Dynamic leadership uses questions differently. A well timed question changes what the brain believes it is solving in the moment, and that alters the emotion before it fully forms. The network of neurons, aka subconscious, is constantly predicting reality. When it becomes certain a threat exists, the system narrows toward rigidity. The challenge is that it doesn't take much for the network of neurons to become certain that a threat exists, and the more stressed we are, the less it takes for that certainty to happen. When overwhelmed, it expands into chaos. Between those two states is coherence. Focus and engage, where clear thinking and effective action becomes possible. The goal is not emotional control. The goal is steering the trajectory early enough that control becomes unnecessary. Same with suppression. Suppression doesn't work when it comes to emotional reactions, and control doesn't work because it just escalates. And there's a reason for that. I've covered that in some of the earlier talks. Rapid recovery is what creates the appearance of stability. The brain may briefly initiate a reaction, but trained interception prevents it from becoming behavior. To observers, nothing happened. To the individual, it feels like presence rather than suppression. This is why dynamic leadership operates before regulation rather than after it, influencing activation instead of repairing consequences. Questions in this model are diagnostic and regulatory levers. They interrupt automatic pattern completion, reveal direction of escalation, and allow the leader to guide the system back toward coherence in real time. And this is occurring in seconds and minutes, not hours and days and weeks. Stability and presence doesn't mean no reaction. It means correction happened faster than anyone could see. And I was tripping over this because from a scientific standpoint or a pure neuroscience standpoint, the word prevention is misleading because it's not really preventing, it's reacting, but it's reacting and correcting in milliseconds. Milliseconds. So technically, it's not preventing it, it's just recovering really fast. And I'm going to start using prevention because the point is it is preventing the thing before it becomes perceptible. And from that standpoint, just like traction control and ABS can be said to prevent a slide or prevent a skid, respectively, they're not really preventing the skid. They're not preventing the slide. What they're doing is noticing when the tire begins to slide and it cuts power in the case of traction control, or it releases braking pressure in the case of anti-lock brakes. Those are both preventive safety measures. They are preventing the accident. They're not preventing I should say it differently. They are preventing the skid, which can lead to an accident. They don't prevent the accident. They don't prevent, really, technically, they don't prevent the skid. What they're doing is correcting the skid so early that to the driver and those around and to the ability of the car to stop, it's as though the skid never happened, which is how I use prevention in dynamic leadership. So before we explore specific emotional intelligence or questions, I'd like to keep three anchors in mind. One, we're steering emotional information or emotional formation, not managing emotional aftermath. Stability is usually rapid recovery occurring before expression. And that's what I was explaining with the traction control example. Because, and even as if you just think back to situations you've been in, you could feel it rising up. You could feel this sensation rising up. That is the first opportunity. In fact, that's already later than the first opportunity to correct it, because the more tuned in you can get to that, and this is not a conscious thing that we're doing. We are training it at the subconscious level. And I use examples in the workshop to help people experience what it feels like to condition something at the subconscious level. It's not that it feels different, but when they experience it, they say, oh, yeah, that's it. I get it. And then the other one, the last one is the objective state is focus and engage, not calm, not intensity, but focus and engage. So what I'll do is take a look at a few things to paint a picture as to make the points before I show you the slides. And then that way the slides can be reinforcing, so I don't have to explain so much on the slides. You can see it and say, oh, yeah, that's what it means. All right, now, the first one I want to cover is, think of it as moving from and to. Just, if you look at traditional, I'm using this for illustration. There's no, you should be able to recall experiences that validate what I'm saying here. So we have, I'm going to make 3 tiers, and this top tier is clearly greater than the lower 2 tiers. And in this case, the top tier is small, the middle tier is large, and the bottom tier is only slightly larger than the other one. So what is this I'm doing? This is what we're going from, and if you look at this as coherence, in both of these, and you look at this as focus and engage, and you look at this as fight or flight. This is what we're doing. This is what dynamic leadership does. This is the essence of dynamic leadership. This is how everything comes back to this, because we're better when we're in focus and engage than we are in fight or flight. Unless you're fighting a tiger. If you're fighting a tiger, you may want those reactions to come up because it's existential. But most of the things that we face in business are not like a tiger. And focus and engage is a much better option because it keeps the options open. And see, here's the thing. When you're in fight or flight, we're using the past. It's using associations. It's using things that worked in the past. And if you've never fought a tiger, it's not really going to help you much anyway. If you have fought the tiger, the next time you fight a tiger, you'll have some good skills at the nervous system level, at the instantaneous level. But for business, focus and engage is much better because focus and engage keeps you open to options. When you're in fight or flight, you close down and you don't see the options. So we're moving from this to this. Now, a lot of your literature talks about doing that with regulation. You'll hear people talk about, yeah, I'm having trouble regulating, or, it's difficult to regulate emotionally. So what we have is regulation. And this word shows up in emotional intelligence. And I would look at emotional intelligence as a very effective response to intrinsic motivation, which was coined in self-determination theory in the late 60s. So self-determination theory says that when you have high autonomy, high competence, and high relatedness, you have intrinsic motivation. We know, anybody who's been in business and setting bonus and things like that knows that intrinsic motivation is much more powerful than extrinsic. Extrinsic is a good short-term fix, but people always leave money on the table. But when it comes to intrinsic motivation, sometimes it seems like there's no limit. The reason I bring that up is dynamic leadership is aligned with both of those. It's aligned with self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, relatedness, and it's aligned with emotional intelligence, the 4 pillars, uh, self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and then relationship management. Those would be the 4 pillars. What we have is, I'm going to show you again a from and a to. And on the from, we have this and this. And we're moving from that to this. So what's the difference? What am I saying here? See, regulation is a broad word. It can mean prevention, but not prevention as in it prevents it from ever happening, because that would be over here. That would be before. But when it happens in here, this is what I'm calling prevention. If it's happening after the start of it, I'm calling it prevention because it's preventing the fight or flight. That's why it's prevention. It's preventing the fight or flight. It's not preventing the neural signal that happens, because the neurological signal will still occur, but because the neurology is the network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second, there's a lot that can happen before you even perceive it. So what we have here is prevention. Here we have modulation. And over here we have correction or corrective action. Because we don't do a good job of prevention, and there's a reason, it's not because we're bad people, it's because the approach to habit change is misunderstood. For centuries, it was thought that the subconscious was a mind and it's us. So then the signals that come from the subconscious are thought to be true because they're coming from what we perceive as us. The reality is it's not a mind, it's a network of neurons, 100 billion neurons, each attached to or connected to 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons connected with synapses. And that's how we have neural pathways. So neural pathways can be myelinated, they can be full with neurotransmitter, and those neural pathways become the path of least resistance. So habits are all about associations. And that misunderstanding, thinking that it was a mind, we spent all our time, for the most part, I'm talking about lay people, I'm talking in general, spending all our time in the corrective action side once we become aware of it. You don't even become aware of it until about a half second, because that's the reaction time of the conscious mind. It would have been thought that, yeah, the conscious mind is just, that's what it happens. There's a delay from the eye, because we think linear, right? Newtonian physics, where it's a linear thing. Oh, it must take time for the signal to get from here to there. No, the signals are traveling at the speed of energy, milliseconds, the thousands of a thousandth of a second. When we start moving things upstream to the network of neurons side, we now have our prevention over here, and takes up much more space. And we have our modulation here, and then we have our corrective action over here. And over time, this will become less and less and less. So what's the difference between prevention and modulation? Using the traction control example, let's go here. Using the traction control example, when a tire is, if you're braking hard and the tire is sliding, that has less traction than when the tire is rotating at the slowest possible point before the skid happens. So for example, a car that's drifting around a racetrack is not going to be anywhere near as fast as a car that has traction going around the racetrack. It looks good, but it's not fast. And the same with traction control. A spinning tire does not have as much traction as a tire that's gripping. That's why they use slicks. That's why they heat them up, because they want that tire in drag racing. They want that tire to bite. The reason why this happens is the rubber settles into the imperfections of the road. That's called pips, P-I-P-S. And as long as this sort of gear effect, as long as that gear effect is there, it has traction. When that gear effect is no longer there, it's sliding with less traction. That's why traction control works. And then in motorcycles, they add this thing, dynamic traction control, because as you lean, you have to share the traction between your direction and the angle. It's like two vectors now. So the traction control will adjust based on the lean of the bike. ABS will adjust based on the lean of the bike. And they call that dynamic traction control. There's also a thing called dynamic suspension, in that the suspension is not predicting the surface of the road. It's reacting to the surface of the road at millisecond level. That's why they can say it makes thousands of decisions a second, because it's happening at the millisecond level, and it's essentially continuous. It's changing the damping of the suspension based on the speed of the wheel movement, right, in the suspension. Much, much more effective than static suspension systems. And what we're doing with dynamic leadership is the same thing. We're going from analog leading to dynamic leading. We're going from static or reactive and corrective to something that's much more like prevention. And that's where this comes from. And what we want to do is go from here to here. And when I talk about leadership development, we can spend the majority of the time on making this shift happen and this shift, so that we spend more time in focus and engage. Because to know and not do is to not know. Most leadership programs, or many leadership programs, focus on more information, more knowledge. But if you're already deviating 60 and 70% from what you know, adding more to what you know is not a wise solution. We want to collapse that deviation. We want to get from deviating 70% from what we know to less than 20% of what we know. So hopefully this is clocking for you. And we do that by creating habits and habitual patterns that we can rely on. And it's not just rely on, it's rely on when the pressure's on, and rely on when the pressure's on during a bad week, and even on a bad day of a bad week. So when everything is against you, you can still go to focus and engage reliably. That's the target. And we'll spend time on that part of the development, because when we do that, we know that people automatically start using more of what they know. Let's take a look at some slides here to solidify this. And then you can also take some screenshots if you like, because that will give you a chance to come back to it. But the explanation goes with what I just shared, because obviously slides are slides and they're not going to be able to have as much content on them and still be practical. All right. I already mentioned the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. This is aligned with that. The big difference is that when emotional intelligence was created in the mid-90s, neuroscience was not publishing enough externally. And the internet wasn't a broadly used thing at the time. So there was a lot of research that was not out yet. And so the belief at the time, and you can see this in the literature, is that identity is fixed, personality is fixed, intelligence is fixed. We can't change ourselves, we can't change our people. And so it focused a lot on the corrective side, and they called it regulation. That's why I went through that sketch of the regulation is all of it: prevention, modulation, and corrective action. All of that is regulating. So when you say I'm regulating, if you're regulating in the traditional sense of it, you're giving up 60 to 70% of the opportunity to actually regulate, which is prevention and modulation. because those are both regulating. It's happening after this thing has started, but it's preventing the catastrophe. It may not be preventing the neurological signal. This is a drawing I use, and I talk about it above the line. Above the line is different than inside the line. This is think of this like your comfort zone where we live, and everyone knows it's difficult to leave your comfort zone. We leave it temporarily and then snap back. We leave it, we snap back. And there's reasons why we snap back. One, it's uncomfortable. Two, it's very, very difficult. Three, there's every fiber in your being is saying no. Remember, you got 100 billion neurons, and they're connected. There's trillions of connections, because anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 connections for each neuron, trillions. And so you may solve a few things, you may answer one thing, but sure enough, there's something else going to come up. There's a story, a bad experience, some violence that you observed or happened, maybe getting bullied, something happened at 6 years old. These things they come up, and they come up when you get in here, because the fear that happens, and the reason fear comes in is because you get this cognitive dissonance. You're doing something you never thought you could do. So you get the cognitive dissonance. Maybe you're excited even, but cognitive dissonance and being excited can have the same energy signature as anxiety. So the anxiety comes in, and you ask yourselves, why am I being anxious? What's going on? You start looking for it at the subconscious level as well as the conscious level. Sure enough, if you look for something, the subconscious will find it. And then you find these things that happen at 5. Next thing you know, you're going down this path. Something that happened at 5 years old, and it's coming up like it just happened yesterday. So that's some work that has to be done to resolve that stuff. But meanwhile, you don't want to put off crossing this barrier. We can get through here, and you have to learn to absorb the cognitive dissonance for what it is and recognize that it's progress. You can't have a breakthrough, which is what this is, without having a break with the past. And when you break with the past, you're moving into unfamiliar, and the subconscious is biased towards seeing the unfamiliar as a threat and danger. And that's why this gets harder and harder. But it can be done, and people do it. I can't tell you this is scientific. There's some light research around it, but when you read biographies, the amount of people in autobiographies, the amount of people who quote unquote made it after they lost everything is pretty high. And it makes you wonder, do I have to lose everything in order to make it? No, I say that it's a matter of understanding the nature of this transformation and letting go of the baggage and the things that are connected, because some of those things that are connected are also connected to these. And it's sort of, in baseball, we say you can't get to second base without leaving first. It's like that. I'm not going to say that you have to forget your associations, but you do have to change who you are. You have to change your identity for the person who's going to make it up here. Up here is completely different. You are every day in the unfamiliar and the unknown. You never know what's going to happen. And so you don't have the habits from 0 to 7 to rely on, and that's scary. That feels difficult. But if you focus on principles, you're going to be okay. And I use near principles, because we don't have the same thing like a sports team in our face trying to stop every play to tell us what really works versus what sometimes works. In business, though, we do have some resources. There are some books that I use because of the amount of research that went into them, broad research. And in the case of Jim Collins' work, he looked at public companies, and there's so much information available with public companies. He was able to do that. He wrote 3 books, Built to Last, but I focus on Good to Great, because those are the companies that broke out of this zone and up here, and then they continue this trajectory for 15 years. So that's the Good to Great companies. And they all had things that they did. He found the things that were common across all of them, and he called it level 5 leadership. And level 5 leadership is what inspired the dynamic leadership. Because how do you become a level 5 leader? It's like, what's the curriculum for that? Dynamic leadership will get you to level 5 leadership. The other 2 books, so it's Good to Great and Great by Choice by Jim Collins. It's Multipliers versus Diminishers by Liz Weissman, and Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. But I actually like The 8th Habit. That's a book that followed it. People don't talk about it much. It felt like it was too much theory, but he's using examples. He read Stephen Covey when he was writing those books. He was out with corporations and teams doing work. He was helping them improve their performance. So he had a real lab in a way that he could test these things. And that's how he landed on the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And then the 8th Habit is a great executive leadership book. When you follow those principles, you're going to still have some zigzag in here, but you have KPIs and you have other tools to keep you on track. And in doing so, you're able to handle the unfamiliar and the unknown without going into fight or flight. You can stay focused and engaged. That's why I say the person who is here is different than who they are when they get up here. You have to become somebody different. You change your identity, you change your personality. And for years, for centuries, we believed that that's not possible. And emotional intelligence is very widely accepted. And the people, emotional intelligence, by definition, tells you that you can't change. And what I'm saying here is sort of like Copernicus and Galileo saying that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. And I feel like that's with emotional intelligence, that the study of emotional intelligence is regulation after the fact. And you can argue that point, and it's not about putting down emotional intelligence. I actually want to stand on the shoulders of emotional intelligence because this is a great body of work. The point is we want to move the action, the initiative, we want to move it much further upstream, and we'll talk about how to do that. It's not theory. And in the workshops, we actually practice it so you can feel it. We always start with small things, the same way we do in special ops training in the military or in martial arts. You start with small, easy things. You don't start with big things, right? You don't, because it creates the fear and it gets people, it's harder to learn when you're under stress. So we want to start with little things in the workshop, but then you have the skill set and the templates and the models to use after the fact to keep building it. And it's like 6 weeks, you'll notice results in 2 weeks. 6 weeks, it's major. You can actually stay calm in chaos. And then it takes about a year to uncover all of those potential things, like when I was talking about here, all those things that you didn't know, those 5 things that happened at 5 years old, the things that have been in a box, in a jar, that you've been suppressing and avoiding. When those come up, we have to deal with them. And that's why I use a 1-year follow-up to it. Now, here's what's going on. The big shift is that most people are working over here in the conscious mind after you become aware. The conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second. So obviously it's going to change. It changes when you're under stress, etc. But the left side, the network of neurons, so that first half second is not just delay. It's not just latency from the signal to the action. It's busy. The subconscious is busy making sure you survive. There's even a pre-listening part before the stimulus. That's the pre-listening, and then you have a half second. The first quarter second includes the pre-listening or adds to the pre-listening, and then you have the initial detection and rapid appraisal. And we can do things in here. You can condition this. This is habit pattern from 5 to 7 years old. So we could change it. That's why I call it a 7-step reset. And then we have the reaction formation. After it's already assessed and figured out what to do, it puts it over here. I have low effort, high impact for habit change. Habit change over here is high effort and low impact. So this is where people try to change the habit. And so it makes sense that it would say you can't change your personality, you can't change your identity, because it's very, very difficult. And all the effort you put in, you get very low impact or very low results. But over here, a low amount of why? Why is it that way? Because here you process at 11 million bits per second. Over here, we process at 50 bits per second. Here is reacting to this and calling it a response. We want to change the reaction to something that serves us. So our response, it's easier to get to a response that serves our purpose in our quest. This is another view of that. I broke it into the first 600 milliseconds because I wanted to capture the half second, but also the 100 milliseconds of pre-listening. This is the readiness. Here's an example. Now I have a dozen levers that I can use across these, and it depends on what works for the person and also what they're going through, what their struggle is. Depending on what their barrier is, we use different levers. And some of it is, I don't want to call it trial and error, but it's iterative. because it's like I'm peeling an onion. You have to get to one point. So, for example, I don't have it on here, but one of the easiest ways to start getting some space so that people can even have this conversation is with implementation intentions. But that's working for the next day. Like I may use implementation intentions for them to use the next time we meet so that talking about something doesn't trigger them. And by the way, this is not mental health. This is about high performance as in leading others. So here the perpetual question. Everyone has a perpetual question. Something like, am I safe? Am I correct? Am I right? And will people accept me? Do I really know as much as I think I do? How do I know that how do I know that this is the way it's supposed to be? Does this really happen? Whatever that perpetual question is, for a lot of people is biased towards degrading themselves. Other people might be like, well, how can I take advantage of this? What's the opportunity? And then you're going to have some bad perpetual questions too, where people are looking to exploit someone. But you can change your perpetual question. The next level, the next 200 milliseconds, so that's 2/10 of a second. The next 2/10 of a second, you have your orientation. This is where I spend more time conditioning the network of neurons, because we have to change it globally. We have to change the global system that was set up from 0 to 7. And this is not me changing you. This is your purpose, and then looking at where your gaps are towards the purpose and what are the weak links, and then we strengthen those weak links. And then the last one, so that's the training I was talking about that takes 6 weeks. You'll notice results in 2, but the calm and chaos, no matter what's going on, shows up more like after 6 weeks, and then you reinforce it. And then the last 2/10 of that first 600 milliseconds is the mobilization. Firing a pre-trained anchor is a good one. Implementation intentions come into play here. And there's some other of the levers that we can apply. Breathing is good. You can actually breathe here. Even though this is before you're consciously aware, you want to get sensitive to what's coming up in your body. So that first 2/10, 4/10 of a second, you can feel a sensation coming up. You can literally build a habit that when that sensation comes up, you take a breath. And a short breath, inhale, and a long exhale is what we're looking for. I also talk about doing breathing exercises and using. All right. That was a quick test, real time. Make sure I'm talking. Yep. Uh, Interesting. So my camera, the main camera that I use, I actually accidentally broke it improving. I was in my studio. I wanted to use a continuous power supply so I don't have the battery go out. And in the process, I moved the camera in such a way that the HDMI cable pulled out and pulled out from the camera, pulled the receptacle from the camera out. And that camera is being repaired. And so I'm using a camera a previous camera, and I just heard the camera cut off. Fortunately, I heard it cut off because I could have gone without any audio for the rest of the time. All right, now, so that covers it here. And then once we go through the mobilization, or using breathing, I think what I was talking about was you can spend time with breathing exercises and then make that an anchor. So you breathe. It could be 5 minutes, but I like to do 10 minutes every day, and it's a way to work through the day, plan the day. And I also am as anchoring and setting that calm. So when something happens, like just now with the camera going off, it's going to take what it takes to fix it. So there's no sense in going into any kind of stress mode. You just stay calm, and you can condition in so that when something happens, you just take a breath. It's interesting that happened just as I was talking about it. I have to get a power supply for this camera so that doesn't happen again. The battery gauges are so unpredictable. They say you have this much battery left, and it doesn't pan out. The next thing we're going to do is look at, get back to, all right. Now, this is the 7-step reset. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I've got a lot of content already that talks about this. But here's where we're staying in coherence. This is where we have coherence. This is our knowledge that we bring to the table. I say to know and not do is to not know. So by being in coherence, we have the ability to use more of what we know. But I make sure we understand beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology, and how that works. And then over here, we have the return to mindfulness and presence. So this 712 is the loop that we're training and making sure that we have. And then in here, in this step 2, is rapid recovery. So this coherence that I'm talking about, this calm state, focus and engage, is a result of being here. See, this conditioned reaction is happening tens of thousands of times a day. We don't have time to use suppression. That's why I call this prevention. This is the whole prevention model. From 712, we're into prevention. We are determining what the network of neurons will be doing by what we condition. And then, so now here's the questions. And I'll just go through this quickly because it should be motherhood and apple pie for the most part. But questions increase engagement and participation. They build understanding, surface assumptions, reduce conflict by slowing reactions, promote reflection and learning. They improve decision quality. So we already trust questions as leaders. We know to use them. It's interesting that in sales, they're taught to use questions to control the narrative, to control the presentation flow. But what's interesting, sales training doesn't always teach the salespeople to bypass questions that come. So it's like they learn that questions control the narrative, but they're not taught that they should bypass questions that come from the other person. If you don't bypass questions that come from the prospect, then guess who has the opportunity to take the initiative and control the flow? So it's one of those things that I think is interesting. You want to do both as a salesperson. You use questions to control the narrative and the flow of your presentation, and you also bypass questions that are coming in. So you're only answering the ones that are really questions for them. So I bypass one, I'll bypass the second time they ask, and I'll bypass that one. The third time they ask, then I'll have an answer for that. But by that time, I've already thought about some different answers, and I'm not answering questions that they don't really have. A lot of times people just ask a question because it sounds like it makes sense or it's a conditioned response. So we already trust the questions. Now I want to look at at what we can get from them. So we usually think questions help people think. Here, I'm using them. Dynamic leadership helps them to stabilize. A well-timed question interrupts automatic reaction. The brain shifts from defending to gathering data, and the answer reveals emotional trajectory. So I like to say that people are either converging or diverging. They're moving towards fight or flight, or they're recovering from fight or flight, going to focus and engage. And as they're going in and out, and it's very fractal. So this may be happening at the seconds and minutes level, but it's also happening at the minutes and hours level, and it could be happening at the weeks level. People can be, quote unquote, dysregulated for weeks at a time. But are they getting worse and worse and worse? Are they getting worse and worse and worse, more fight or flight? Or are they recovering from that? So when they ask a question or they give an answer, they're telling me what it is at the point in time. I have to ask another question to determine the direction. Are they moving towards more fight or flight, or are they moving towards coherence? And that second question will give me an idea, especially in a coaching situation. I need that second question to get direction and intensity. And also, I mean, without getting too deep in the weeds there, but you can have going deeper versus going shallow, or are they going wider, or are they coming back in? So you can look at it two different ways. The answer, as I said, reveals emotional trajectory. I need to know which way they're going. And then the leader is steering state, not extracting information. So in dynamic leadership, we're using the response to questions to give us that information so that we can steer the state. We don't want people going in to fight or flight. A person who goes into fight or flight and then into that second level of it where the cortisol and adrenaline are flowing, that could take hours to subside. Once you have, and we've all been there, that's a neurobiological event. You've got the cortisol flowing. Just you want to prevent it. And again, that's what we're doing here. I said a question is not a reflection, it's an intervention. What the brain actually does. So the brain predicts first and then reacts. And that pre-listening that I showed on that other slide, the brain is trying to figure out in this kind of environment what's likely to happen. So it's predicting first, and then when it doesn't happen, it it actually cuts back on the neurotransmitter production. That's why people age. One of the reasons why people age faster than they need to is because they stop putting a demand on themselves, and that demand, that pre-listening, is constantly predicting more than what's coming, and so it reduces the neurotransmitter. The signal to the muscles reduces, and that's where you get that. That's why you can move the age decline line from the 40s well past 75, and there's research showing that already, but they don't talk about it from the neurotransmitter standpoint. It's essentially the difference between homeostasis, which is stabilizing the status quo on a decline, versus allostasis, which is stabilizing on a horizontal trajectory, more horizontal trajectory. So the mind is constantly predicting, and that's just an example of it. Back to the dynamic leadership conversation, certainty increases emotional intensity. So when somebody feels really certain about something, and you can see this in some of these arguments on social media where you can see they're like so intense, and even though their argument doesn't hold any water, they start attacking the person's character, but the intensity around certainty is there. And you go back to cognitive biases. If a person hears three things that are undeniably true from a given source, they'll automatically believe the fourth thing from that person, because now this source is credible because they've given them three things that are undeniably true. There are newsletter companies that have used this to convince people that they're credible. They'll send out a bunch of different predictions. The ones who get the correct prediction, then those get another set, and the ones who get that correct prediction, then they get the $10,000 offer, and they buy it because these guys are credible. The challenge, though, once that confirmation bias kicks in, it takes up to 11 iterations of counter information before they no longer believe it. And so if a person is running a con, all they have to do is every few times throw in a few sprinkles of credibility, and the person is right back to the start. That confirmation bias is extremely persistent. And by the way, when I started down this path, it wasn't about dynamic leadership. I was looking at protecting leaders from the cognitive biases that derail us. And here's where we landed. A question forces model updating. That's what we're doing here. We're updating the model. Updating lowers threat activation. So it's not just updating the model. We're lowering the threat activation. And by lowering the threat activation, we're able to stay and focus and engage and stay out of fight or flight, because we're not facing tigers. You don't need that level of intensity. You don't need that adrenaline. You don't need adrenaline to answer an email. Change the problem the brain thinks it's solving, and you change the emotion that's forming. Converging versus stabilizing versus overexpanding. I already talked about this. You kind of get the point. I ask those second questions to know where they are. So good leaders don't calm emotions, they redirect trajectories. But in order to redirect a trajectory, you have to know which way the trajectory is going. And where dynamic leadership lives. Most models regulate after emotion forms, which is that drawing that I made. This intervenes before. It intervenes before the conscious mind reaction time of a half a second, because we're conditioning that. Now, expression can still be intercepted. Even after the person begins expressing, you can still intercept it. And then rapid recovery prevents visible behavior. Stability is fast correction, not absence of activation. Let's take a look at this. I want to illustrate this because I think it's at the core of what we're talking about. All right. I have two graphs. We have been told, and many believe, that things like personality, identity, cannot be changed. And I'm here to tell you that you can change them. These are constructs. Personality is a construct. Identity is a construct. It's it's a collection of the many habits that go on. So what I say is we don't, if you try to change it at the construct level, it's very, very difficult. You can change it at the elements level much more quickly. Many people have been successful at changing personality and identity using visualization, meditation, and then visualizing. And it can take months, it can take years, but people have learned to do that. They've changed their personality, they've changed their identity. And one of the reasons I think it leads to this idea that it can't be done is because sometimes, remember that graph, that picture with the stories? I think sometimes what happens is that people will run into difficult situations, and as a result, they fall back into old ways, and it's like their personality didn't change. What I am saying is that by doing it at the habitual level, at the elements level, you are making the change. And in for leadership conversation, I want to talk about presence. And presence, something they teach in military, is also a construct. And when you think about the idea of a senior leader, we think of that presence. And people, the boards will often find people who have presence as the priority because humans respond to that presence. And I think if, I can go down some rabbit holes, but if you look at, we love sports. We love sports because we like to see people who have that presence under all this pressure. And I think that's fitting. And it goes back to hunter gatherer time. Remember, we've been evolving for tens of thousands of years. We've only been living in this current situation as humans in the evolution for the last 500 or so years, and not even, and that's drastically changed if you just go back a century. So I think there's a lot of things I've read that one of the reasons why public speaking is a top fear is because in the hunter gatherer tribe, if you spoke up against the tribal leader, you could get killed. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't there. But the point is, there's a lot in our habitual patterns, our system, that you can trace back to the hunter-gatherer time. So these are two graphs, and one is this, very, very high, and then the potential drops off. So this is like potential. The other one is very, very low, then it rises, and then it tapers off. This is effort. This is impact. So if we're trying to change our presence, or our personality or our identity, and let's call these tenths of a second. Same thing here. So by the 5th second, conscious mind is kicking in. This is where the conscious mind kicks in. And the effort, if you work to change your presence and personality at the millisecond level, network of neurons side, the effort is very, very low. It doesn't take much. A few patterns, a few interventions, some mental rehearsals, some implementation intentions. You can change it at the millisecond level. It's very low effort, but your impact is very high. When you change it in this first half second at the subconscious level with retraining your habit patterns, your conditioning, low effort, high impact. If you're fixing it on the conscious mind side, this is where I started talking about this with the corrective action. If you're fixing it on the conscious mind side, the effort is very, very high. This is why we've come to believe you can't change habits. What I'm telling you is you can change habits, and you can change personality, you can change identity, you can build your presence by doing it over here, because the impact is much higher. And over here, even though the effort is very, very high, the payoff is very, very low. And because of that graph that I showed you in the beginning, we still have relapses where we go back to the way it was before. And as a result of that, people believe, okay, I guess I can't, and they give up. It's just not worth it. The payoff is not there. There's shortcuts, there's hacks. By the way, the reason hacks don't work is what I was talking about with homeostasis and allostasis. Homeostasis is attempting to stabilize at the status quo level, whereas allostasis is stabilizing at the trajectory level, like that graph that I drew earlier. So again, the expression can be intercepted, and that's what we're talking about with dynamic leadership. Rapid recovery prevents visible behavior. So we're not correcting the behavior, we're fixing it like the traction control fixes it dynamically at the millisecond level. The reaction starts neurologically, but never becomes behavior. And this is why I keep tripping over the statement about prevention, because I'm not preventing the neurological input. What I am preventing is the catastrophization, the fight or flight. And then we have the operational model. Every question performs 3 operations: interrupt the pattern completion, diagnose regulation direction, and then select the next intervention. So we're broadening the focus or deepening accordingly. That's what we're doing. We're interrupting, we're diagnosing, and we're selecting the next intervention. That's dynamic leadership, and we're not doing it consciously. You already know this stuff, right? That's why my development plan focus is really getting people to have agency and personal leadership real time. Use what you know, and then let's reassess and look at the gaps. Dynamic leadership is real time steering of emotional formation. Here's that graph again. And this is where it's easy. This is what I mean by low effort, high impact. It's easy over here compared to over here, and certainly compared to the results, because over here is processing at 11 million bits per second. Over here, we're processing at 50 bits per second. If you just do the math, you'll see that the effort to impact ratio is way outsized over here. And here is a look at that. Now, this doesn't tie exactly because the other one is in milliseconds, and you can look at these are levels that the person moves along. So baseline, this is the pre-listening. The brain pre-weights meaning before stimulus arrives. Leadership works best when we're preparing the system to act the way we need it to, rather than some other reaction that you're going to have to correct later. And then you have set productive perpetual question. That's what we do at the pre-listening. Attention. I'll let you screenshot that because I've got another event starting in a few minutes here. And this is what I was earlier saying. We're building this kind of trajectory, but you have to break through that barrier, and you have to be able to execute consistently up here. And we use consistency and simplicity and methodology, and it's tied to principles and near principles. That's why it's reliable. And then I go live. So I'm not going to be on tomorrow, so I'll be on the road, but I will be live. I'll be in the mountains, so I'm going to see how that works out. Friday, Thursday, and Friday, and typically, well, next week I'll be on 7 to 8. 7 to 8, except for the 26th when I'm doing the workshop. So we are teaching this methodology, the 4 pillars of self-mastery. You can find it at 7stepreset.com/mastery. Sign up for that workshop, and we go through this in the 4 pillars, but we do practice exercises, all live, no recording, no artificial intelligence. And the last thing is, I will take a look at this. This is lead with presence, not position. Let's see what we're doing on time. I'll do this on Thursday. I'll go through this on Thursday as a nice recap to hear. And we'll just talk about how you can use what I'm talking about here. So this is an infographic from this person here, Mark Franzoni. It's related to emotional intelligence. He says you can join his free newsletter. Go ahead and do that. You can see his information. You find him on LinkedIn. But what I'll talk about Thursday is how we can use the dynamic leadership to do this, not with corrective action, but with prevention. All right, that's it. I will leave it there, and then we'll see you on Thursday. I'm doing an Ask Me Anything right after this. We'll do an Ask Me Anything and follow that with, I'll do a replay of that tomorrow because Wednesday is my normal time, and then we'll be back on track next Monday. See ya.